Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. We're going to finish up on this topic of the new monarch. So we're going to transition to a minute for something about the economy, because we talked a lot about taxes. We talked a lot about how these new monarchs were able to take power, even if they ever become absolute power. Not yet. We will see one other issue here, and that is a commercial revolution. That's going to be very important to the era. And that will lead us into the next lecture, which of course is the Age of Exploration. And so what we're going to see here is a transition period. And again, some causes of this commercial revolution. Again, note, the roots of this are in that late Middle Ages. We talked about the Hanseatic League, right? We talked about, that originally the Hanseatic League was a defense mechanism along the coast of northern Germany, but it began to be a much more commercial enterprise. This begins to set the stage. In addition, we will start seeing a population recovery. We start seeing 70 million people in 1500, 90 million people by 1600, and thus more consumers. So they need more goods, they can buy more things. We also see increase in food prices, the increased volume of money, the influx of gold and silver, in part because of exploration. And what we see here is a change, though, because it's not just the upper classes. Yes, we're going to get joint stock companies. We'll talk about them in a minute. Things like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, those things we'll talk about in a minute. But what's important here is we start seeing the rise of the middle class. This middle class bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie. And the difference is these middle class are merchants. These are not your traditional nobles. And thus we see a growing new class system develop during the commercial revolution. That is, again, part of this is that they're going to owe a lot of their allegiance then to the monarch, not to nobles, not to land, because these guys don't own all the land. They are focused a lot on the economy. They don't have these large landholdings. Instead, they want to deal directly with the monarchs, with the government. Again, so this is a continuation of the new monarch system with the evolution of the economy. Now, part of this is going to take place with things like the enclosure movement. We're going to begin to enclose the fields of Europe. Because up until this point, the original process was just, hey, open fields, peasants can work it. But as we begin to enclose things, things become more privatized. And we're going to discuss that in much more detail in a future lecture. But more importantly is what you see on the left, the beginning of what we would know as mercantilism. Now, again, this is being led by a lot of reasons. Number one is the Age of Exploration we'll talk about next. But we'll see, though, that this idea of bringing in raw materials, the idea of using joint stock companies to raise large amounts of money. Let me go on one quick. I want to see here. So the idea of banking to facilitate this is all a really important phenomenon. So let me back up here and talk about banking for a minute. The Fuggers in Japan, the Medicis in Italy, were among the leading bankers in Europe. However, those were, again, noble families. As we transition to this commercial banking period, this commercial revolution period, we start seeing places like Antwerp in Flanders, that they'll become the leading banking and commercial center of Europe in the 16th century. By the 17th century, it'll be Amsterdam. After the Dutch Revolt, we'll talk about them later. So we start seeing the transition of the banking system, where it once was those big, wealthy families, the Fuggers and the Medici, which are still important, granted. But we start seeing a transition in Europe to that northern coast where the Hanseatic League was. And the Hanseatic League begins to control the trade in northern Europe well into the 16th century. And by using the banking system at Antwerp and ultimately Amsterdam, this begins to allow the transition of power and influence to those northern sea trading routes rather than Mediterranean sea trading. And again, the Hanseatic League is very important in this. Now, this league would be a mercantilist association. In other words, they would have this mercantilist idea. And then we start seeing the rise of what's known as joint stock companies. Because the idea was that if you have one noble family who is in charge of this, well, that's a big risk for one noble family. Instead, forget the whole noble family idea. Instead, use a pooled investor resources. So have a bunch of investors, whether they're nobles, whether they're some of the royalty, whether they are more middle-class merchants. Let them pool their resources together and create what's called a joint stock company. They're all going to come together for a common purpose, and so this becomes a forerunner of a modern corporation. And so what we see here is the expansion of trade is made much more easy through this organization commercially of the joint stock company. You can buy shares in the company, so investors can get wealthy off this. People receive dividends. And a board of directors runs the company. Investors receive profit. Of course, the two most famous of these, the British East India Company and, of course, the Dutch East India Company. And these joint stock companies make it easier to raise a large sum of money for trading ventures or exploration. And what we see is then we start seeing that mercantilism, extraction of raw resources, bring them back to the mother country, and allow these joint stock companies to trade them across Europe and elsewhere, and ultimately into Africa, obviously, and the colonies elsewhere. And then we see that we start seeing the growth of ship industry, right? And so this idea of this ship industry is able to, again, help facilitate this trade for long overseas exploration. We'll talk about in the next lecture. And of course, this only exacerbates and increases and accelerates the process of mercantilism. Now, mercantilism, once again, this is an important concept to understand. It is the extraction of raw materials, but it's a strategy that sought to create a favorable balance of trade where your country exports more than it imports. And the only way to do this is to have colonies, because you're able to extract raw resources and then turn around and export all those resources. So remember, just because you're bringing, sugarcane or gold back from the New World does not mean you're importing that. That's just yours. You are then exporting that stuff to other nations, including Africa, to buy, of course, enslaved individuals. And by doing so, this is a new phenomenon for a couple of reasons. Number one is the process, and exploration facilitates this. Number two is the shipbuilding industry, use of joint stock companies to gather these resources. And then number three, we see that the rise of mercantilism gives the state a new role in the commercial development and the acquisition of colonies overseas. Notice, this gives the state a new role in the economy. Again, this is why I keep this part of this lecture rather than move it on as part of the next lecture, which is exploration. Because this is a role of those new monarchs. New monarchs are able to take greater control over the economy because they're able to implement this mercantilist idea, mercantilist economy, by the use of private joint stock companies. So again, middle-class entrepreneurs, middle-class merchants, they're able to use this new group of wealthy individuals, this middle-class bourgeois, to raise and basically maintain greater power for themselves. Now, in doing so, they will also not only try to achieve this favorable balance of trade, where they export more than they import, they will encourage the emigration of foreign workers. Again, engineers, printers, musicians, miners, farmers, armor manufacturers, artillery specialists, copper workers, cauldron makers, weavers. Why? So that people can bring skills in. And France led the way in this, encouraged foreigners come in. It also allowed them, through this process of mercantilism, to establish quality control standards. In other words, you don't want, someone to make a silk garment in Nice versus one in Paris and have a lower quality. You want to have quality control. And thus we see competition, we see commercial competition, and France was saying, no, we want the French to be the best in the world at this, so we will bring in the best, experts at making these products. It makes sure we have quality control as well. And the last part of this is the idea what's called bullionism. Now, bullionism ultimately is where a country believes it should hold as much gold and silver as possible. Again, you can see why this factors very well in with the idea of mercantilism. Collect as much from your colonies as possible. So it creates a new economy, not only for exporting things, mercantilism, but also for having cash reserves to build up your stash, your treasury. So, significance of this. What are the consequences of all this? Well, New monarchs do consolidate power. They will create more centralized power, but they will never achieve absolute power. On the downside, let me come back here one more time, just last second here. So they will, what are some of the consequences, though, of the commercial revolution? Back up for just a minute. Well, what we're going to see is increased population in this period, from 60 to 85 million people in the 16th century. Now, are war, famine still a problem? Yep, they are. But we will see increased economic prosperity and this population. Cities begin to grow as a result of this. We will start seeing cities having more than 100,000 people in them. In fact, by 1600, Paris has a population of over 500,000 people. But despite the advent of larger cities, despite the advent of richer, beautiful homes, we will start seeing crowded tenement housing. Crime, pollution, filth, lack of sanitation, lack of fresh water, lack of food will still plague these cities. So there's a downside, a dirty underside to this commercial revolution. And then finally, just to give you a comparison here, a quick chart to take a picture of, taking your notes. The new monarchs will consolidate their power. We will see a beginning of the rise of nationalism. We will see the foundation of a modern nation state, but never achieve full nationalism or absolute power. That's a 17th century phenomenon. And then a quick comparison between Western and Eastern Europe. So again, this nice little short introduction into our kind of a bridge between the new monarchs idea of, because remember, they're the ones who are able to gain power as a result of the commercial revolution, but then transition to our next lecture, which is, of course, Age of Exploration, Columbian Exchange. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.